like to thank Aoife and Nathan for including me in the catalogue and for their very careful editing of what is, I think, going to be a very valuable and important publication. I'd just like to start by talking about the topicality of Reid's work. Why does it matter now? I think one of the really, obvious things about her work is, and her practice, is how deeply aware she was of the environment, of her surroundings, and in terms of what we're going through now, at this moment, and how badly this has been, this day has been, well, we're working around it, but you know, that it was going to be a much more social occasion. And even the unseasonable warm weather and so on, all of these aspects, I think, make Reid's work very, very relevant. She was living through a period in the late 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. Well, compared to now, probably not so bad, but I think from her perspective, they were decades of very dramatic change, growth and urbanization. She was seeing the destruction of the landscape, the ancient landscape, and also of the city, the ancient or the medieval parts of the city and so on. So those would be this idea of responding to change, of dealing with change, of using painting and art to express those kind of ideas and those feelings, I think, are of crucial importance to Reid's work, to, if you like, to an audience that is maybe not interested necessarily in the history of art. And she typifies the artist. Most artists, we would hope, would be extremely sensitive to their surroundings, and the function of their work is to make us aware of that. So that's maybe something that I'll return to later on when I talk about her work. Then just really to mention about the exhibition, the significance of the exhibition. I mean, this is the first major exhibition devoted to Nano Reid, since the 1970s? Yeah, so is that correct? Yeah. So, I mean, this is a very historic exhibition, and it's, you know, again, we were talking about this last night, it's kind of remarkable that there haven't been more exhibitions devoted specifically to figures like this, to major figures like this. So, being able to see this range of work in close proximity is hugely valuable, I think, to understanding Reid's practice and the range of her work. I mean, I've kind of changed my mind about some of the things I wrote about in the catalogue, not too much, but a little bit, just in seeing this, because before this, you know, I'd only have seen Reid's work in group shows, usually in sort of auction houses, or in shows put together by David Britton, and I congratulate and thank, I think, David Britton and Karen Reichel for keeping, for generating huge interest and awareness of the work of artists like Nano Reid. Through their exhibitions and through their research. Karen has produced, I think, very important research in which Nano Reid, you know, has emerged as a key figure in her relationship with Dylan and Campbell and so on. So the exhibition, I think, is very important in rethinking and reevaluating Reid's work. The range of it, the control, I'll talk about these a little bit more later, the colour that she uses, the intimate scale of the work. And its significance overall. So just to say, my knowledge, as I've touched on it, my knowledge of Reid's work, I suppose, goes back to the 1990s. I would have seen her work usually again in auction houses or in exhibitions connected with Adams of the Frederick Gallery. And you would just see one Nano Reid on its own, or two maybe, but you would rarely have the opportunity to make this kind of comparison that we have here. Rarely would you see her work in a museum or gallery, which is, I think, quite shameful, really. So again, I would acknowledge the generosity of lenders to exhibitions like this, because most of the work comes from private collectors, and it's really significant to allow outsiders, if you like, to get a sense of her work. The Dylan Reid exhibition, which was when about 2005 or 6, 2009, was one of the first big opportunities to see her work, and I saw that here in the Highlanes and in the F.E. McWilliam, and that really produced the notion of Reid, I suppose, as a bohemian, but also kind of supporter of Dylan. And just very briefly to go through the kind of my sort of biographical knowledge of her, but I think it relates to what I'm saying later on, I hope it does, is just to say that that catalogue of the Dylan Reid show was very significant publication on her work. Rianne Coulter then wrote a very important essay in the book that Emer O'Connor edited upstairs on Irish women artists, where she talked about Reid as this bohemian outsider figure. And then Declan Mallon's book, of course, been published, I think, in the 90s, is a wonderful account of Reid's life in Drogheda, but also her earlier background in France and London and Dublin, and she comes across in that, and it's wonderful again to hear these. You talking about her and remembering her, it really is, I think, fantastic to hear these kind of stories about her. She comes out of Mallon's book, again, as a feisty figure, but also quite a timid, in some ways quite timid, especially as a young woman.
Anyway, she's also mentioned and highly thought of in other more historical accounts of Irish art, but Brian O'Doherty's Irish Imagination exhibition catalogue, which was published in 1972, Reid comes out of that as a very important figure in Irish art. And Brian Fallon, in an essay he wrote in the 1980s, an essay ostensibly about Tony O'Malley, but he used it to talk about the history of Irish modern art and painting. Again, Nano Reid comes in for particular mention.
So she's generally very highly regarded. Another important article on her is Patrick Swift's article on her work in Envoy, which was published in the early 1950s. So we have this kind of background, and I think this catalogue and this exhibition is now kind of updating some of those ideas or rethinking them in terms of the contemporary moment, and perhaps I hope will be a starting point for further research and a proper re-evaluation really of Reid's work, but also what was going on in Irish painting in the 20th century. So, so now I'll just go on to the catalogue, to my catalogue essay. The starting point of my catalogue essay was, I was thinking very broad terms, was actually the original title of it was, I think, Nano Reid, One of the Boys, or something like this, to do with gender, which is an area that's, I suppose, been of interest to me in terms of Irish art. And Rianne made this point ages ago when the Dylan Reid exhibition was held, that she's often compared to male artists. During her lifetime, she was often compared to male artists like Jack Yeats or Patrick Collins or even Tony O'Malley. And that, of course, was considered a good thing by those that were writing the text, who were usually male critics. And why was she compared to male artists, male painters? There seemed, I think, to be a directness in what she was doing. There was this incredible expressive quality that an Irish artist particularly associated with male artists. She was seen, I think, to have an odd conventionality, not just about her life, but about her actual approach to painting. She was daring, she took risks, and this was, in a way, the opposite to the work of artists like Nora McGuinness or older artists like Mamie Jellett and Evie Hone, whose work was much more closely tied into the language, directly to the language of Cubism and the School of Paris. And they didn't seem to move away from it in the way that Reid's work did. She also had this more, ostensibly anyway, she seems to have this more kind of bohemian lifestyle. I mean, again, this is all open to question, but from what I've read and heard, that she developed these very close friendships with male artists and writers and women as well, of course. She lived in, I suppose, flatland in the 1940s. she was friends with younger artists like Dylan, as I've said, and George Campbell. And she, in a number of her works, like Friday Fair is one that I discuss in particular, she refers to this kind of bohemian world and she relishes it. It's a big, I think, theme in her paintings. I'm also, I suppose, in relation to her positioning her as a kind of an Irish woman artist, I think that she was very different, perhaps, in her background and outlook to, again, artists like Nora McGuinness, or, again, those older artists, in that she came from a Catholic background, I mean, a relatively wealthy background. She was very non-Dublin. I mean, I know Nora McGuinness came from Donegal Derry, but there's something about Reid's work that she remains kind of this outsider, going off to the West and then coming up and spending the later part of her career in Drogheda. She just seems to be very independent and a kind of an outsider figure, and it's very much, I think, reflected in her painting and in her work. I should also say one of the reasons that I was really delighted to be asked to write about her work is that I've always been a huge fan of Nano Reid's work. I've always been drawn to it and always thought she is a very important, distinctive artist, distinctive painter. So this kind of forced me to say, well, you know, why is she distinctive? What's different about her? And I'll kind of get on to that in a moment. Just to talk briefly about her training, she went to the Metropolitan School of Art and would have had, I presume, quite a conventional training, but presumably from what we've seen here, would have learned about illustration and so on. And then she went to Paris in 1927 to study at La Grande Chaumière, which is a very well-established, independent sort of studio or atelier, where other notable artists of the period, or earlier and of that period, studied. But I think from what I remember from Mallon's work, or I might anyway get the sense that she was maybe homesick or she didn't settle in. I don't know how true that is. We can maybe discuss that later. And then she studied for a time in London. So she had a much more formal training than many of the male artists with whom her work is compared. You know, she studied in Dublin. She would have had a very strong academic training there. And then she went off to Paris and London. So, I mean, Jack Yeats didn't really receive a full training at all as a painter. Dylan and Collins were really quite self-taught. And there's also, I think, a contradiction about the way she talks about her painting. She talks about, for example, of starting a painting as like jumping off a precipice. And this is where, you know, she takes a risk, as I've said, and we can see that in her work. But at the same time, there's a very careful control over what she's doing in her work, which I think goes back to that, perhaps her training, but perhaps also what she saw in Paris in particular in the 1920s, or maybe something that she looked at later on in the 1930s and 40s. There's, as I say, a sense of draftsmanship seems to be very important in her work. Line seems to be very important in her work. This idea has been mentioned of scraping back into the surface of the paint, drawing outlines within it, and some of the sketches that we've seen there suggest, you know, that drawing was a very significant part of her practice. So although it may seem kind of chaotic at one level, it's actually, I think, very carefully controlled. And she obviously then in the 1930s moved away. She started, as we can see in the works upstairs, the portraits and the paintings of the little boy from the west of Ireland, or it looks like it's from the west of Ireland. She started with quite conventional kind of realist painting that would have been very dominant in Irish art in the 1930s. And it's normally credited with her seeing the work of Mary Howitt, this Belgian painter who had come to Ireland and had painted in the west of Ireland and exhibited her work in Dublin in 1934. That's usually identified, or it has been, by Rian and Aoife in that catalogue, the Dylan Reid catalogue, as being a major moment. And it seems to have given her, whether it was that or was presumably other things as well, a moment of great confidence in what she was doing, and a decision really to move away largely from portraiture and representational realist art into much more consciously, I suppose, modern painting that uses expressionism and cubism. And the cubism, as I've said, underlines her work, I think, right up into the 1970s even. It's that has structure, it's the drawing, it's the spatial understanding that she brings. And so cubism, I think, is important as well for the flattening of space that we find in her work. And, you know, this idea that really, you know, very central to, I suppose, modern painting, modern art, is that fundamentally you're looking at a two-dimensional surface, and that the artist is compressing the three-dimensional world and their experience of it onto that surface. And that's, you know, what she develops then, I think, in terms of the later part of her career. And also with cubism, you get this sense of animate and inanimate forms combining in her work. So I meant to say that at the beginning about this idea of her being interested in the world around her. I mean, she loves animals. She's fascinated by animals. And many of her paintings include birds or animals. And so there's animate and inanimate forms. There's kind of ancient forms and contemporary forms. There's also human figures. And most of those are very closely connected to the land, like the tinkers or gypsies that you've just mentioned there, are the workers in the land. And that, I think, is a development, you know, from cubism. If we think of the musicians playing in those flattened cafes with their signs and so on, it would be, I would say, a very important way of reading her work. And as I said, Brian O'Doherty mentioned that in that Irish Imagination exhibition in 1972. He actually said that Nano Reid was the only artist really that carried on the tradition of cubism in a meaningful way in Irish painting, which I thought was interesting. So then to talk about the distinctive method of her painting, and again I'm echoing what Bob said there, about the physicality of her work, but maybe what both of you are saying. Absolutely. Her painting, I have said, like that work there, for example, Early in Summer, it has a sort of what would be thought of as a phenomenological exploration of space. There's something, she creates paintings that are very, very tactile, very, very physical, both in the surfaces of the works, the way that they're created, but we also get a sense of the artist's bodily involvement in the works themselves. And that's what I meant really by this kind of materiality. So it's an embodied process, an immersion in painting that makes her work, I think, so exciting. There's this kind of, again, I was thinking of it in terms of, when I was writing the essay, could we say this is a sort of feminine way of thinking about things, this, this jouissance, this almost erotic pleasure that we get from the tactile, from feeling things, from sensing things, the dampness, the darkness, the dirtiness of the earth is, I think, wonderfully evoked in Reid's work. And so that I was thinking of, I'm moving out, I'm not a theorist, I'm not great at theory, but trying to push out her work and thinking of it in terms of some sort of theoretical. The phenomenological was one. And even perhaps abjection, Chris Davis' idea of abjection, that is something that revolts us, but it's something that also gives us intense kind of pleasure. And I think there is something about her work in that has never really been discussed, perhaps not surprisingly, over the course of the 20th century. So far from that, this idea of expressionist painting being a masculine thing, you could argue actually that it's equally a female thing or a feminine thing. Just to talk briefly about the comparison with Yeats, because seeing the paintings again, and actually one of the connections is that Nathan very kindly invited me to write an essay about Embodied, and Nathan was very involved in it. The Jack Yeats exhibition up at IMA, and writing about that, there's a connection really in that, well, for Yeats and Reid's work, I don't think reproduces very well. Now in terms of technology, and the catalogue here we can see actually it does, but conventionally, over the course of their careers, their work would not have produced very well. And I remember when I first started teaching about Reid's work in the 90s and early 2000s, the images that I was showing were really pretty awful. So the point I'm making is that really to understand Reid's work or Yeats's work, you need to be there. You need to see it. It's very much that kind of work, and the artist, I think, is consciously producing that work with their audience in mind. You know, so it's like, that's what I meant really, and it wasn't me, it was Brian Fallon actually who first compared her work with Jackson Pollock. Now it's not really, it's much smaller and more intimate than Jackson Pollock, but I think what he meant was that idea of the event, that there's something that went on there, there's an event that went on there, and we can access that when we stand in front of her work. There's a tremendous sense of movement and energy throughout the work that relates to that particular idea. Okay, so now I hope I'm keeping on track here as to what I was going to say. Yeah, just to talk about Yeats, generally speaking. Now, I think she was, in her lifetime, I've read several times, she was the artist who's mentioned as carrying on the Yeatsian tradition, but she's not directly, I don't think, related to his work. She doesn't, you know, she's a completely different painter in many ways, but they do have some interesting things in common. Most importantly, that idea of needing to be there, that idea of the event. Yeah, this is the point I was going to make. They're little clues, they're clues in their paintings that you are encouraged to read, you're encouraged to make sense of the work. And I don't think in many of these paintings, I personally would find it very difficult to make complete sense of their work. And the same with Yeats's work. And just to go back, I suppose, to Brian O'Doherty's essay on the Irish imagination, he talked about there being a very sort of small, relatively small community of people in Ireland that were really interested in modern art from the 1940s, he was talking about, up into the 1970s. And I know, you know, seeing the exhibition here, I noticed that Reid paints on this very small, quite intimate scale, generally speaking. This larger work here was painted for, you know, that was commissioned work to go into that bar, restaurant, and the same with the big mural upstairs. But generally speaking, she paints on quite a small, intimate scale. And generally speaking, Yeats paints on a small, intimate scale, and the same with Patrick Collins and most of those artists. So, and their work would be shown, you know, at the Living Art probably every year, and then they would have had exhibitions in places like the Dawson Gallery. And so the same sort of small group of people would be coming and seeing their work every year. And I actually think there was a very direct engagement between, maybe I'm completely wrong about that, but I like to think there was a direct, you know, little playing with games that Yeats I think certainly did it, definitely did it, and Reid, we can explore that idea of pushing things further, of bringing the viewer in, the people probably that they knew and would, you know, understand their work and get the kind of jokes and so on, or the games that they play. And that brings me to another point about Reid's work, is that it has a sense of humour. And that's maybe what differentiates it from Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. And that's what's delightful about her work. You know, I think the inclusion of the animals, she was dismissed as a painter of pussycats, which, as a cat lover, I obviously take huge exception to that. But I think anybody who says that's missing the whole point about her work. It combines, there's sort of epic paintings, but there's an intimacy about them. And the inclusion of animals like cats and so on, you know, brings up that kind of idea of intimacy. So just to move on, the other thing, I suppose, about her work, which might connect it more to Collins and makes it very different from Yeats's work, and it relates again to this idea of the embodiment that we see in her work, is that really you're pushed into the ground, as I talked about it already, really. You're submerged in the ground in her work. Very rarely is there a sky or a horizon line. You're pushed right down into the earth. And I think that relates, I suppose, to ideas of abjection and submersion in the work, and it's a very, very distinctive aspect, I think, of Reid's aesthetic. Yeah, and it relates to the body. It's a bodily thing as well. And ironically, myself and Niamh McGuinn, and maybe others here, we're archaeologists as well as all the other things. And so we have worked on excavations, and ironically, given the fact that Reid obviously detested, I think probably with very good reason, archaeologists, you do tend to, when you're working like that, you actually have a view of the ground in the way that Reid's paintings have. You're just looking at the earth and moving down into the earth, and so on. So she's, yes, as I say, submerging the body. She's looking at the hidden, the mysterious, the treasures, if you like, in the earth. She doesn't want to take the sort of scientific approach of actually destroying them, and, you know, as was happening at Knowth and particularly at Newgrange in the 50s and 60s. So then just finally, to sort of finish off about her work, I suppose the other thing is that, again, for somebody my age, when I first became interested, I suppose, in contemporary art in the 80s and 90s, there was a huge aversion of women to paint. Women artists didn't paint because it was associated with people like Jackson Pollock and a whole load of Irish neo-expressionists who were very macho, basically, to put it in very simple terms. And so painting was often thought of as, you know, not appropriate. Women used made things, or they used more conceptual methods. And again, I suppose what's topical about the exhibition is that now we're seeing a resurgence of painting. And it's, to me, I obviously really enjoy and love painting, and it makes us rethink about the validity of painting and the fact that actually here's a woman artist who is able to use it in what has been described in a text that I quote in the essay as a kind of compassionate involvement. And this is where those qualities of, I think, the environment, of empathy are very, very central to Reid's work, but also to the validity of her practice today. And then finally, the essay I just finish off by Shauna Whalen, who describes Reid, and it echoes what's been said here, as a willful woman, rather than just you know, a woman who paints like a man. Far from it, she paints like a woman. And so the exhibition, it's really, I think, a very important celebration of the work of Reid, and, as I've said, a recognition of the value of her work as a major 20th century painter. So thank you.